modern superheroes.
He was a loyal operative, a master of deception, and a builder of lies in service to an empire that thrived on fear. For years, he carried out missions in silence, creating false realities, silencing dissent, and betraying trust, all under the veil of patriotism. His hands crafted narratives that crushed opposition, his words became weapons against innocent lives, and his loyalty to the regime was unshakable. But shadows can only hold a man for so long. One fateful moment forced him to confront the truth. The lives destroyed, the families shattered, and the future stolen in the name of power. The walls of loyalty crumbled, and the weight of complicity grew unbearable. Now, he stands in defiance of the very system that made him, risking everything to pull back the curtain on a machine designed to control and oppress. This is not just his story. It's a revelation of a world built on lies and a call for justice that cannot be ignored. The story unfolds in modern Russia, a nation where power rests in the hands of an elite few, maintained through an intricate web of manipulation and control. At the heart of this machine is the Federal Security Service, or FSB, a force tasked not only with protecting the regime but with silencing its critics, both at home and abroad. Through disinformation campaigns, fabricated charges, and covert operations, the FSB operates as an invisible hand, shaping public perception and stifling dissent. The protagonist, a man known to his handlers as Ulyanov, was a critical piece of this machinery, recruited under pressure and offered promises of purpose. He became an agent in a world where truth was disposable and loyalty was rewarded with privilege. His missions were diverse but unified in their purpose, to sustain the regime's grip on power. Whether infiltrating activist groups, spreading false narratives on social media, or crafting intelligence reports to justify crackdowns, Ulyanov's work was emblematic of a system designed to manipulate and oppress. Yet this was not a life of simple allegiance. Beneath the surface lay a world of systemic corruption that eroded the very foundation of loyalty. Operatives were pawns in a larger game of political chess, often left to fend for themselves when risks became too great. Promises of protection and honor frequently gave way to betrayal, as those at the top prioritized their survival over the lives of those who served them. It was a system that thrived on fear, not trust, a reality that would eventually force Ulyanov to question everything he once believed in. Surrounding all of this was a society grappling with deep inequalities and economic strain. For many, loyalty to the state was not a choice but a necessity, a means of survival in a system that punished dissent. Ulyanov's story is not just about his actions, but about the forces that compelled him to act, forces that echo in the lives of countless others caught in the same web of control. His journey from operative to whistleblower is a lens into the broader dynamics of power, fear, and resistance in a world that often leaves its most loyal servants behind. Ulyanov's story is one of secrets kept, lies told, and truths uncovered. For years, he was at the center of Russia's covert operations, a key player in a shadow war waged against activists, journalists, and even foreign governments. His hands orchestrated disinformation campaigns that manipulated public perception and infiltrated opposition groups to dismantle them from within. But behind every assignment, there was a growing unease, a realization that the machine he served was built on the destruction of lives and the suppression of truth. One revelation stands out among the rest. In a remote operation, Ulyanov was tasked with fabricating intelligence reports to incriminate a respected academic, a foreign scholar accused of espionage simply for researching history. The operation was meticulous, fake evidence, planted narratives, and a coordinated smear campaign. Ulyanov remembers the detailed instructions handed to him by his handler, every line scripted to perfection, every word a weapon. It wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a stark reminder of how far the regime would go to maintain control. Watching an innocent man's reputation crumble under the weight of these lies shook Ulyanov to his core, forcing him to question not only his orders but the entire system he had pledged to serve. And then, there were the disinformation campaigns. Vast networks of trolls and bots unleashed to drown out dissenting voices online. Ulyanov managed accounts that spread lies, tarnished reputations, and fueled propaganda. These weren't faceless operations. They targeted individuals, communities, and entire nations. He saw how a single false narrative, launched at the right time, could spiral into chaos, turning public opinion, silencing activists, and even inciting violence. Each operation felt more insidious, eroding his sense of purpose and pushing him closer to the edge. He began to recognize the horrifying power of the machine he served. It didn't just destroy lives. It obliterated the very concept of truth. But it was his final mission that sealed his decision to defect. Tasked with infiltrating a human rights organization, he was to gather intelligence on whistleblowers and dissidents seeking refuge abroad. The details were chilling: surveillance on activists, coordinated leaks to discredit them, and even plans to intimidate their families back home. It was a line he could no longer cross. The same system that had coerced him into loyalty now demanded he betray those who sought justice. The very justice he had begun to crave himself. The mission became his breaking point. A moment where Ulyanov realized that serving the regime meant sacrificing the last fragments of his humanity. Ulyanov's escape was nothing short of audacious. It spanned continents and required the careful navigation of allies who believed in his cause. Every step was fraught with danger. A misstep could mean imprisonment or worse. He recalls the chilling paranoia of checking every shadow, every sound, knowing that his former handlers would stop at nothing to silence him. Yet he persevered, driven by a singular purpose: to expose the truth and dismantle the web of lies he once helped weave. Now, for the first time, Ulyanov is ready to unveil the full extent of what he knows. From the inside workings of Russia's factory of trolls to the covert missions targeting innocent people, his story is a testament to the courage it takes to confront injustice. His revelations paint a vivid picture of a regime that stops at nothing to maintain its grip on power, using deception and fear as its tools. Each revelation is a puzzle piece in a larger picture of systemic corruption, raising questions that demand answers. How deep does this machinery run? How many lives have been silenced? And, perhaps most importantly, what can be done to stop it? With every word he speaks, Ulyanov chips away at the walls of secrecy that have long protected the regime. His story is not just a confession. It's a call to action, a plea for accountability, and a beacon of hope for those still caught in the web he escaped. This is his chance to undo the harm, one revelation at a time. But the question lingers: will the truth be enough to challenge the empire of lies? Faidar was born in the quiet, mountainous region of North Ossetia, a place of stunning natural beauty, but also one steeped in historical struggles. From a young age, he was drawn to the stories of courage and resilience that his family often told. Legends of warriors defending their homeland and tales of survival against impossible odds. These stories painted a vivid backdrop to his childhood, but they were also juxtaposed with the stark realities of life in a region grappling with economic hardship and systemic neglect. Faidar's family, like many others, faced a daily battle to make ends meet. His father, a construction worker, was often out of work due to inconsistent projects, while his mother worked long hours as a schoolteacher, earning barely enough to keep food on the table. Watching his parents struggle instilled in Faidar a sense of responsibility from an early age. He dreamed of rising above the circumstances that seemed to define his community, aspiring to bring stability and pride to his family. Education became his escape, and he excelled in school, particularly in history and languages, often impressing his teachers with his sharp intellect and disciplined demeanor. Despite his academic talents, Faidar was deeply affected by the social and political turbulence that surrounded him. Growing up in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, he witnessed the chaos of transition, a time when corruption became a way of life and opportunities were limited to those with the right connections. He saw friends and neighbors fall victim to a system that promised progress but delivered inequality and despair. These experiences ignited a quiet resolve within him. He would find a way out, a path that would allow him to rise above the hardships he saw daily. When Faidar turned 18, that path presented itself in a seemingly straightforward but fateful opportunity. A local recruitment officer approached him with an offer to join a state-sponsored program, promising steady income, training, and a chance to serve his country. At first, it seemed like the answer to his prayers, a way to lift his family out of poverty and achieve a sense of purpose. The program was framed as a noble endeavor, offering young men a chance to work within government structures that claimed to prioritize the nation's safety and stability. Faidar saw it as a way to merge his dreams of upward mobility with his admiration for the stories of heroism he had grown up with. But beneath the surface, the offer was far more complicated than it seemed. The recruiters played on Faidar's vulnerabilities, presenting him with an idealized vision of signing up. They emphasized loyalty, duty, and the chance to protect his homeland, but they were careful to downplay the darker aspects of the role. By the time Faidar realized the full extent of what he had agreed to, it was too late to turn back. His early assignments were benign at first, gathering intelligence on local civic groups and reporting on public sentiment in his region. But each task brought him deeper into a shadowy world where loyalty meant silence and questioning authority was met with swift consequences. Fidar found himself drawn into a life he hadn't fully understood, navigating a delicate balance between his aspirations and the harsh realities of his new role. The seeds of doubt were sown early, but for now, they remained buried beneath the surface. Fidar's journey into secrecy wasn't one of ambition, but of necessity and circumstance. The aspirations of his youth, to protect his family, to achieve something greater, to contribute to a cause bigger than himself, were twisted into tools of manipulation by a system that saw him as expendable. Yet, even in the early years, there were moments of resistance, quiet, unspoken questions about the price he was paying and the cost others would bear. These doubts would linger, waiting for the right moment to rise to the surface and challenge the life he had been thrust into. Fidar's journey into the shadowy world of intelligence began with what seemed like an inevitable collision of circumstances. A moment when his ideals were pitted against the stark realities of survival. At 20, after years of struggling to find steady work in an increasingly fractured economy, he was approached by a former teacher who had taken up a new role in local government. The offer seemed innocent enough at first, assist with data collection and administrative work for regional officials. It was framed as a temporary opportunity, a stepping stone towards something greater. But behind the friendly invitation lay something far more calculated. Unknown to Fidar, his academic excellence, reserved demeanor, and knack for languages had already caught the attention of local intelligence operatives. They saw in him the potential for more than just clerical tasks. They saw a tool, someone malleable and idealistic enough to serve their purposes. Soon after he accepted the role, he found himself pulled into a closed-door meeting with two sharply dressed men who introduced themselves as representatives of a national security initiative. The pitch was seamless, even seductive. They spoke of patriotism and duty, weaving a narrative of threats to the motherland that required sharp minds and loyal hearts to counter. They framed their offer as a rare privilege, a chance to serve on the front lines of safeguarding the nation. For a young man raised on stories of heroism, it was difficult to say no. Yet, something about their words felt heavy, laden with unspoken implications that Fidar couldn't quite place. When he hesitated, the coercion began, subtle at first. They reminded him of the hardships his family faced, painting the offer as an answer to his prayers. A steady income, access to resources, and opportunities far beyond the reach of most in his community. They hinted at the consequences of rejecting such an opportunity. The unspoken suggestion of doors closing if he walked away. The pressure was compounded by veiled remarks about loyalty and the importance of supporting a system that had allowed him to achieve his potential. By the end of the meeting, Fidar felt as if his choice had already been made for him. His first assignment was deliberately small, a test of both loyalty and skill. He was asked to infiltrate a local community group suspected of harboring extremist elements. His task was to befriend key members, gather information, and report on their activities. The group, as Fidar would soon learn, was little more than a gathering of intellectuals and activists. Teachers, students, and volunteers discussing societal challenges and advocating for reforms. Despite their harmless nature, Fidar carried out his orders, believing he was serving a greater cause. It wasn't long before his handlers escalated his responsibilities. He was tasked with writing reports, falsifying details where necessary to fit the narrative his superiors wanted. These reports were then used to justify raids, arrests, and crackdowns on dissenting voices. Each mission blurred the lines between truth and deception, forcing Fidar to navigate a murky moral landscape. He began to see how his role, once sold to him as honorable, was part of a much larger system designed to suppress opposition and control the narrative. The turning point came when he was asked to fabricate a report about a local activist, a man well regarded in the community for his charity work. The evidence against him was thin, almost non-existent, yet Fidar's superiors demanded results. The guilt gnawed at him as he watched the man's life unravel under the weight of false accusations. It was the first time Fidar felt the full weight of his complicity, and it marked the beginning of an internal struggle he could no longer ignore. As the assignments piled on, so did the pressure. Each mission seemed to push him further from the ideals that had once guided him. The system, he realized, thrived on control, of information, of people, and, most insidiously, of its own operatives. Fidar's loyalty was no longer a matter of choice but of survival, as every exit was blocked by the same system that had ensnared him. Yet, deep within, the seeds of defiance were beginning to take root, waiting for the right moment to grow. This was not the life he had envisioned, and he would soon face the ultimate question. How long could he serve a system he was beginning to despise? Fidar's transformation into Ulyanov was not an abrupt shift, but a carefully orchestrated metamorphosis. After proving himself capable in his early assignments, He was summoned to a secluded office within the regional intelligence headquarters. There, his handler presented him with a new role, one that required him to leave behind his old identity and adopt a persona crafted specifically for infiltration and manipulation. The identity of Ulyanov was meticulously designed. His backstory was that of a disillusioned university dropout from Moscow, someone with a penchant for activism but easily swayed by ideology. The persona allowed him to move seamlessly within circles of dissidents and reformists without arousing suspicion. Every detail, from his accent to his social media profiles, was tailored to make him appear authentic. The training was intensive, covering everything from improvisation techniques to psychological manipulation. Ulyanov wasn't just a name, it was a character, a mask FSB would have to wear with precision. His first assignment as Ulyanov tested the limits of this new identity. He was sent to a neighboring city to infiltrate an activist network advocating for government transparency. His mission was to gain the trust of the group's leader, a young woman named Natalia, who had been organizing peaceful protests and exposing corruption in local government. FSB, now Ulyanov, posed as a fellow idealist, attending meetings, sharing insights, and gradually becoming an integral part of the group. He learned their routines, their fears, and their hopes, all while carefully feeding information back to his superiors. The duality of his role began to weigh heavily on him. As Ulyanov, he found himself inspired by the passion and integrity of the people he was tasked to betray. Natalia, in particular, embodied everything FSB had once aspired to be. Fearless, determined, and unwavering in her belief that change was possible. Yet, each time he reported on their activities, providing details that would later be used to dismantle their efforts, he felt the growing chasm between his actions and his conscience. As the missions escalated, so did the complexity of his role. Ulyanov became a tool for more than just intelligence gathering. He was now an agent of influence, tasked with sowing discord within groups to weaken their cohesion. In one instance, he subtly suggested strategies that led to internal conflicts among activists, causing fractures that would take months to heal. The success of these missions earned him praise from his superiors, but each victory felt like a personal defeat. The further he delved into his role, the more he struggled with the realization that his work was perpetuating the very injustices he had once dreamed of fighting against. To maintain his cover, FSB had to adopt a rigid compartmentalization of his life. As Ulyanov, he lived in a world of constant deception, navigating the minefield of his fabricated persona. As FSB, in the rare moments he could return to himself, he grappled with the moral toll of his actions. He developed habits to cope, writing in a secret journal, reflecting on the person he had been before all of this began. But the lines between FSB and Ulyanov began to blur, leaving him uncertain of where the character ended and he began. Despite his internal conflict, he continued to excel in his role. He infiltrated opposition parties, social movements, and even online forums, always adapting his persona to fit the situation. Yet, with each new mission, the cracks in his resolve grew deeper. Ulyanov was an identity built on lies, but it also became a mirror reflecting the truths FSB didn't want to face, that the system he served was a machine designed to destroy hope, not protect it. Navigating the duality of being both an insider and an imposter left FSB in a constant state of tension. To his handlers, he was a rising star, a loyal operative who could be relied upon to carry out even the most delicate tasks. To himself, he was a man losing sight of who he truly was. The role of Ulyanov was supposed to be a tool, but it was becoming a prison, a life defined by deceit, where the cost of survival was the erosion of his soul. It was a life he would soon find increasingly impossible to live. Espionage, as FSB came to understand, was less about cloak and dagger operations and more about mastering the art of influence. As an operative, his toolkit wasn't limited to surveillance or intelligence gathering. It included psychological manipulation, digital warfare, and an uncanny ability to exploit human vulnerabilities. The assignments blurred the lines between reality and fiction, transforming the battlefield into an unseen arena where narratives could topple governments and misinformation could silence movements. One of his primary tasks was overseeing disinformation campaigns on social media. The regime had recognized the unparalleled power of the internet, not just as a tool for connection, but as a weapon for control. FSB managed fake accounts, posing as ordinary citizens to infiltrate online communities. These personas were carefully crafted. Each had a believable backstory, regional dialects, and even mundane daily posts to make them appear authentic. Through these accounts, he spread propaganda, amplified polarizing content, and created chaos within opposition movements. The goal was simple: confuse the public, discredit activists, and drown dissenting voices in a sea of manufactured outrage. One of the most insidious tactics was what FSB and his colleagues called echo chambers. Through coordinated efforts, they would infiltrate activist spaces online and insert divisive topics, subtly steering discussions into unproductive arguments. By the time the activists realized what had happened, their momentum was often lost. These operations, though seemingly minor, had devastating effects on grassroots movements, eroding trust and unity among their members. FSB recalls one particularly impactful campaign aimed at discrediting a prominent opposition leader. His team fabricated a scandal, complete with doctored images and fake testimonies. Within hours, hashtags accusing the leader of corruption began trending across platforms. Troll farms, massive networks of operatives like himself, swarmed comment sections and discussion boards, ensuring the narrative stuck. By the time the leader issued a statement refuting the claims, the damage was already done. His credibility was eroded, his supporters disillusioned. FSB's role in this operation was pivotal, and though his superiors praised his efficiency, the ethical cost weighed on him. Beyond the digital realm, FSB's work extended into the physical infiltration of opposition groups. As Yu Linov, he attended rallies, joined strategy meetings, and gained the trust of activists. His job was twofold: gather intelligence on their plans and subtly influence their actions to benefit the regime. Sometimes, this meant sowing seeds of doubt among members, fostering internal conflicts that weakened their cohesion. Other times, it involved redirecting their efforts toward less impactful causes, effectively neutralizing their momentum. One operation stood out, a campaign targeting a youth-led movement advocating for electoral reform. FSB embedded himself within the group, befriending its charismatic leader, Sergei. Over weeks, he collected details on their strategies, financing, and key members. But his handlers demanded more than intelligence. They wanted the movement dismantled. FSB orchestrated a subtle sabotage, suggesting changes in their messaging that alienated key demographics and divided their supporters. When the group's protests fizzled out, the regime celebrated another victory, while FSB wrestled with the betrayal of people who had trusted him. The regime's tactics weren't limited to opposition groups. They extended to neutralizing journalists and independent media. FSB was often tasked with crafting counter-narratives to undermine investigative reports. If a journalist exposed corruption or abuses of power, his team would flood social media with alternative explanations, discredit sources, and question the journalist's integrity. In extreme cases, fabricated evidence would be leaked to paint them as foreign agents or criminals, effectively silencing their work. FSB's assignments also included more insidious tasks, targeting individuals to destroy their reputations. One such operation involved a whistleblower who had leaked evidence of corruption within a state-owned enterprise. The regime's response was ruthless. FSB's team fabricated incriminating documents, suggesting the whistleblower was involved in embezzlement. Fake witnesses emerged, their statements amplified by controlled media outlets. Within days, the whistleblower was not only discredited but faced criminal charges based on entirely false evidence. Watching the life of an innocent person unravel filled FSB with an inescapable sense of guilt. As the scope of FSB's work expanded, so did the creativity of the disinformation campaigns. Entire fictitious narratives were constructed to manipulate public sentiment on a national scale. One campaign involved creating a fake environmental crisis in a neighboring region, diverting attention from ongoing protests in the capital. Using staged photographs, fabricated government documents, and planted news reports, the regime successfully shifted the public discourse. By the time the truth emerged, the protests had already lost their momentum. These operations, though effective, left a trail of confusion and mistrust that lingered long after they ended. The methods of systemic disinformation were as vast as they were effective. From creating viral memes that spread falsehoods to staging fake interviews that appeared on state-controlled TV, the regime's reach was unparalleled. FSB was a cog in this machine, a soldier in a war fought with lies and manipulation. Every mission demanded a level of detachment he found harder to maintain with each passing day. The successes he delivered for his superiors came at the expense of countless lives. Reputations ruined, voices silenced, movements crushed. Over time, the scope of his work revealed the true nature of the system he served. It wasn't just about maintaining power. It was about erasing opposition altogether, ensuring no alternative narrative could take root. FSB realized that in this war of influence, truth was the ultimate casualty, and his role was central to its destruction. Each assignment deepened the conflict within him, pushing him closer to the realization that he could no longer be part of a machine that thrived on deceit. Yet leaving wasn't just about escaping. It was about finding a way to make amends for the harm he had caused. Fidar's journey was not one of blind allegiance, but of constant internal conflict as he navigated the widening chasm between the values he once held and the demands of the system he served. Each mission brought new ethical challenges that tested his sense of morality and pushed him closer to a breaking point. One of the earliest cracks appeared during an assignment involving a local activist group advocating for better living conditions in impoverished communities. The group was peaceful, their goals reasonable, yet Fidar was ordered to gather intelligence that would justify their suppression. Posing as an ally, he attended meetings, befriended members, and earned their trust. One evening, as the group discussed plans for a public demonstration, a young mother shared her story of losing her home to corrupt officials. Her pain was palpable, her fight deeply personal. Fidar listened, knowing full well that his report would likely lead to her arrest. That night, he sat in his apartment, torn between his duty to his superiors and the humanity of the people he was betraying. The dissonance only grew during a high-profile operation targeting a journalist investigating ties between regional officials and organized crime. Fidar's team was tasked with discrediting her work, planting fabricated evidence to accuse her of colluding with foreign intelligence agencies. Watching her reputation dismantled in real time was agonizing. But the moment that haunted him most was seeing her teenage son publicly defend her integrity, unaware that her fall from grace was orchestrated by Fidar's hands. He began to question whether his actions served any greater purpose, or if they merely perpetuated a system of oppression and lies. One of the most harrowing moments came during his time infiltrating a human rights organization. The group provided legal aid to victims of state abuses, families torn apart by wrongful imprisonments, survivors of police brutality, and whistleblowers seeking asylum. Fidar's role was to identify vulnerabilities within the organization, but in doing so, he encountered stories that deeply unsettled him. One such case involved a young lawyer tirelessly fighting for the release of her falsely accused brother. Her dedication reminded Fidar of his own sister and the bond they shared. Reporting on the organization felt like betraying not just them, but also himself. It was a turning point that marked the beginning of his growing disillusionment. The weight of his moral dilemmas became unbearable when he was ordered to fabricate a case against a prominent academic accused of spreading subversive ideas. The professor, a soft-spoken historian, had spent decades advocating for critical thought and open discourse. Fidar was instructed to plant evidence that linked the professor to an alleged extremist network, a fabrication that would destroy his career and legacy. In their brief interactions, the professor's kindness and unwavering belief in the power of truth struck a chord in Fidar. He followed orders, but the guilt of tearing down an innocent man's life became a wound that refused to heal. Fidar's personal life also began to unravel as the burden of his actions seeped into his relationships. Estranged from his family, he found himself unable to explain the nature of his work, fearing both their judgment and their safety. He avoided close connections, knowing that his role required constant secrecy and deception. But isolation came at a cost. He often wondered whether his estrangement was a price worth paying for a loyalty he no longer felt. Each mission compounded the sense that he was on the wrong side of history. He began keeping a secret journal, chronicling the moments of doubt and despair that punctuated his assignments. He wrote about the faces of the people he had betrayed, their lives shattered by the reports he filed or the lies he spread. In these entries, he questioned the legitimacy of the system, the validity of his orders, and the morality of his choices. The journal became both a confession and a lifeline, a way to hold onto the fragments of his conscience in a world that demanded its suppression. Fidar's handlers noticed his growing hesitation and addressed it with cold pragmatism. They reminded him of the consequences of disobedience, not just for himself, but for anyone connected to him. The implied threats were clear. His family's safety depended on his continued compliance. This coercion only deepened his inner conflict as he realized how thoroughly the system exploited not just his loyalty, but his love for those he cared about. As the missions escalated, so did his doubts. Fidar began to see his role not as a protector of the nation, but as a cog in a machine that thrived on control and manipulation. He was asked to betray trust, to destroy lives, and to perpetuate a cycle of fear and oppression, all in the name of a greater good that seemed increasingly hollow. The moral dilemmas were no longer fleeting. They were a constant presence, gnawing at his sense of self and leaving him to wonder how much of his soul he had left to sacrifice. Fidar's internal conflicts reached a boiling point when he was ordered to target a group of student activists campaigning for democratic reforms. These were young, hopeful individuals who believed in change, much like Fidar had in his youth. Watching their efforts crumble under the weight of disinformation campaigns and state-sponsored sabotage was unbearable. For the first time, he openly questioned his role, asking his handlers why such innocuous movements were treated as existential threats. The response was chilling. Loyalty doesn't question, it acts. From that moment, FSB knew he couldn't continue down this path. The system demanded obedience, but his conscience demanded change. Each decision weighed heavier than the last, pushing him closer to a realization he could no longer ignore. To reclaim his humanity, he would have to abandon the shadows he once called home. One of the most defining operations of FSB's career was a high-stakes mission targeting Alexei Ivanov, a charismatic opposition figure who had gained traction for exposing government corruption. Ivanov wasn't just a thorn in the side of the regime, he was a symbol of hope for a growing movement demanding transparency and reform. To the system FSB served, Ivanov was an existential threat, a spark that needed to be extinguished before it ignited a fire. The operation, code-named Shadow Cloak, was meticulously planned. FSB was assigned to infiltrate Ivanov's inner circle under the guise of an independent journalist sympathetic to his cause. The role demanded precision. FSB had to gain Ivanov's trust while secretly feeding his handlers details about his strategies, allies, and vulnerabilities. Every interaction was monitored, every piece of information dissected to find a way to neutralize the opposition leader, without elevating him into a martyr. FSB's first assignment was to gather evidence of financial improprieties within Ivanov's movement. Knowing this would be difficult given the group's transparency, his handlers had already fabricated documents suggesting offshore accounts and hidden donors. FSB's role was to subtly introduce these falsified documents into the narrative, leaking them to sympathetic media outlets and using his planted journalist persona to amplify the claims. The initial wave of reports caused a ripple of doubt among Ivanov's supporters, but it wasn't enough to dismantle the movement. The second phase of the operation was more insidious. FSB was tasked with orchestrating internal divisions within Ivanov's team. He focused on two key advisors, each with differing views on how to approach their cause. Through calculated conversations, subtle suggestions, and careful manipulation, he fueled a rift between them. Arguments turned into public disputes, and soon the group's cohesion began to crumble. What had once been a unified movement began to fracture, giving the regime more room to tighten its grip. But the most impactful part of the mission came in the form of a character assassination campaign. Using state-controlled media and troll farms, the regime launched a coordinated attack on Ivanov's personal life. They fabricated stories of infidelity, linked him to criminal enterprises, and even accused him of working with foreign intelligence agencies. FSB played a crucial role in feeding these narratives to journalists and social media influencers under the regime's control. The campaign was relentless, saturating the media landscape with so much misinformation that even Ivanov's staunchest allies began to question his integrity. What made this mission particularly haunting for FSB was the depth of its personal impact. During his time within Ivanov's circle, he saw firsthand the human cost of their efforts. Ivanov's wife, once his fiercest supporter, grew weary of the constant attacks. His children, barely old enough to understand politics, faced bullying and isolation at school. Ivanov himself, though resilient, showed signs of the toll the campaign was taking. Moments of exhaustion and despair that were hard to reconcile with the image of an unshakable leader. FSB watched as the man he was ordered to destroy struggled to hold his life together, and for the first time, he began to see his target not as an enemy, but as a victim of the system he served. The operation's success was undeniable. Ivanov's reputation was tarnished, his movement weakened, and his influence diminished. Within months, he announced his withdrawal from public life, citing concern for his family's safety. To the regime, this was a victory, a proof of their ability to eliminate threats without resorting to overt violence. FSB's role was celebrated within the agency, and his name was mentioned in whispers as one of their most effective operatives. But the cost of this mission left an indelible mark on FSB. The betrayal of trust, the destruction of lives, and the manipulation of truth weighed heavily on him. For weeks after the operation, he replayed his conversations with Ivanov, his family, and his team, haunted by the realization that his actions had destroyed not just a movement, but a man's life. It was a turning point, a mission that underscored the full extent of the regime's ruthlessness and the price of his complicity. FSB's journals from this period reflect his growing disillusionment. He wrote about Ivanov's unwavering belief in change, his sacrifices for his family, and the moments of humanity that shone through the chaos. The operation, though successful by the regime's standards, marked a breaking point for FSB. It was no longer possible to view his missions as mere assignments. They were acts of destruction that left him questioning the very foundations of his role. As he continued to carry out assignments, the shadow of Shadow Cloak loomed large. It became a symbol of everything he despised about the system, a system that thrived on fear, deception, and the suppression of hope. This mission, more than any other, set him on a path of reckoning, forcing him to confront the question he had been avoiding. How much longer could he serve a system that destroyed everything it touched? Fidar's breaking point didn't come from a single event, but from a series of moments that forced him to confront the grim reality of his role within the regime. For years, he had been able to compartmentalize, convincing himself that his actions were necessary for the greater good. But as the missions grew more ruthless, so too did the toll they took on his conscience. The facade of loyalty began to crack, revealing a man who could no longer ignore the weight of his complicity. It began with an operation involving a group of university students advocating for democratic reforms. They were young, idealistic, and full of hope, traits that Fidar, once upon a time, had admired. His mission was to infiltrate their network, gather intelligence, and dismantle their efforts before they could gain traction. At first, it was business as usual. He attended meetings, posed as a sympathizer, and built trust within the group. But as he got to know them, their passion and sincerity began to resonate with him. They weren't extremists or foreign agents, as the regime had claimed. They were simply young people yearning for a better future. One student, Elena, stood out. She was a law student who spent her evenings tutoring underprivileged children and her weekends organizing peaceful protests. Her determination reminded Fidar of his younger self, before the system had shaped him into a tool of oppression. Watching her speak to a crowd of supporters, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, knowing that his report would soon lead to her downfall. The operation escalated when his handlers demanded results. Fidar was instructed to plant incriminating evidence, leaflets promoting radical ideologies and a fake donation record linking the group to a foreign organization. When the group was raided and its members arrested, Fidar witnessed their fear and confusion firsthand. Elena, defiant even in handcuffs, locked eyes with him as she was taken away. "We trusted you," she said quietly. Her words cut deeper than any reprimand he had ever received. That night, he wrote in his journal for hours, struggling to reconcile the man he had become with the ideals he once held. Another pivotal moment came during an assignment targeting a whistleblower who had leaked evidence of corruption in a state-owned company. The whistleblower, a mid-level accountant named Yuri, had risked everything to expose embezzlement by high-ranking officials. Fidar's task was to destroy Yuri's credibility by fabricating a case against him. The regime spared no effort. False documents, planted witnesses, and a relentless media campaign painted Yuri as a criminal and a traitor. When Yuri was arrested, Fidar attended the trial as part of his cover. He watched as the man pleaded his case, presenting meticulously documented evidence of corruption, only to be met with scorn and a predetermined guilty verdict. Yuri's wife sobbed quietly in the back of the courtroom, clutching their young son. Fidar left the trial feeling hollow, his justification of just following orders ringing emptier than ever. The breaking point finally arrived during an assignment involving a rural community displaced by a government-backed development project. The villagers, who had lived on the land for generations, were forcibly removed without compensation or recourse. Fidar's mission was to suppress any public outcry, which included discrediting local leaders who were organizing protests. He was ordered to fabricate stories about the leaders' supposed financial mismanagement and immoral behavior. The regime's media outlets published these lies, and within days, the movement lost its momentum. During a follow-up visit to the village, Fidar saw the human cost of his actions up close. Families were living in makeshift shelters, their homes reduced to rubble. An elderly woman approached him, mistaking him for a government official. She clutched his hand and begged him to listen, showing him a faded photograph of her house before it was destroyed. "This was our life," she said. "Why do you take everything and leave us with nothing?" Fidar couldn't respond. He simply walked away, her words echoing in his mind long after he returned to his superiors with his report. What made these moments unbearable was not just the suffering he witnessed, but his own role in perpetuating it. He had joined the system with the belief that he was protecting his country, but now it was clear that he was part of a machine that thrived on fear, manipulation, and destruction. The people he targeted weren't enemies, they were ordinary citizens who dared to challenge an unjust regime. Each mission left him more disillusioned, the weight of his actions pressing heavier on his conscience. Fidar began questioning not only his role, but the very foundation of the system he served. He saw how it manipulated loyalty, exploiting the fears and aspirations of people like him to maintain control. The regime's power wasn't built on strength or unity, it was built on lies, and he had been one of its architects. The breaking point wasn't a moment of rebellion, but a slow, painful awakening. Fidar realized that he could no longer silence the voice inside him that screamed for justice. The system demanded his loyalty, but it had taken too much: his ideals, his humanity, and his soul. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond the shadows, a life where he could make amends for the harm he had caused. It was a terrifying thought, but also a liberating one. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the first flicker of resolve to escape. Fidar's escape was a culmination of months of planning, a perilous journey that demanded every ounce of his skill, resolve, and courage. The decision to defect had not come easily. It was the result of years of internal conflict and the growing weight of his conscience. But once he committed to it, there was no turning back. His first step was to erase every trace of suspicion, a delicate act that required him to maintain his role as a loyal operative while secretly preparing for his departure. The catalyst came during a routine assignment in a neighboring country. Fidar had been sent to monitor a conference where dissidents and activists were expected to gather. It was the perfect cover, providing him with an opportunity to slip away without immediate detection. Before leaving, he encrypted a cache of documents, evidence of the regime's disinformation campaigns, fabricated cases, and the systematic destruction of dissent. These files, stored on multiple secure devices, were his insurance policy, a way to ensure his story would carry weight in the face of inevitable denial. The night of his escape was marked by a calculated calmness that belied the chaos brewing beneath the surface. Under the pretext of gathering intelligence, he left the conference venue and made his way to a prearranged meeting point. His contact, a local journalist who had secretly supported opposition movements, handed him a forged passport and details for crossing the border into a nearby country sympathetic to political defectors. Every step was fraught with danger. Any misstep could mean capture or worse. Crossing the border was a nerve-wracking ordeal. Fidar joined a group of migrant workers being smuggled across the mountainous terrain, blending in to avoid detection. The journey was grueling, with freezing temperatures and treacherous paths that tested his endurance. At one point, they encountered a checkpoint manned by local authorities. Fidar's heart pounded as they inspected the group, but his forged identity held up under scrutiny, allowing him to pass through. The relief was fleeting. He knew the hardest part was still to come. Once across the border, Fidar contacted a human rights organization he had secretly researched in the months leading up to his escape. The organization arranged temporary shelter and facilitated his contact with foreign officials willing to grant him asylum. Even in this relative safety, paranoia gripped him. He knew the regime would be searching for him, and their reach extended far beyond national borders. He changed locations frequently, avoided using traceable communication methods, and lived under constant fear of discovery. The decision to go public with his revelations was equally fraught. Fidar understood the risks, not just to himself, but to his family and anyone who might be associated with him. Yet, he also knew that silence was no longer an option. The evidence he carried was too damning, the truth too important to remain hidden. He contacted a prominent international journalist with a reputation for exposing state abuses. Their meeting, held in a remote location, marked the beginning of his transformation from fugitive to whistleblower. For hours, Fidar recounted his story, detailing the operations he had been a part of, the lives destroyed by the regime, and the mechanisms of control it employed. He shared the encrypted documents, each file a testament to the regime's systemic corruption. The journalist listened intently, asking probing questions to piece together the full scope of Fidar's revelations. The process was cathartic for Fidar. Each word felt like a step toward redemption, a way to confront the harm he had caused. When the story broke, it sent shockwaves across the world. Headlines highlighted the regime's manipulation of truth, the targeting of dissidents, and the intricate web of disinformation campaigns orchestrated by its operatives. Fidar's name became synonymous with courage and defiance, though it also painted a target on his back. The regime predictably dismissed the revelations as fabrications, branding Fidar a traitor and issuing international warrants for his arrest. Their attempts to discredit him only underscored the truths he had exposed. Even in exile, Fidar faced immense challenges. He struggled with survivor's guilt, haunted by the faces of those he had betrayed and the lives he couldn't save. His family back home became a point of leverage for the regime, with officials harassing them in an attempt to silence him. Despite these challenges, Fidar remained resolute. He began collaborating with human rights organizations, advocating for systemic reforms, and working tirelessly to ensure that the stories of the regime's victims were not forgotten. Fidar's escape was not just a physical journey. It was a transformation, a reclamation of his humanity after years of being complicit in its destruction. The decision to expose the truth came at a great personal cost, but it also gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Through his revelations, he hoped to shine a light on the shadows where power thrived unchecked, giving voice to those who had been silenced. As he continued to speak out, FSB became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even within systems of oppression, there is room for defiance. His story resonated with others trapped in similar circumstances, inspiring them to question, to resist, and, when possible, to act. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but for FSB, it was a road worth taking. For the first time in years, he was no longer a servant of lies. He was a beacon of truth, lighting the way for others to follow. When FSB first decided to expose the regime, he knew it would be a battle against time, credibility, and fear. He had spent months collecting evidence, carefully documenting the systemic abuses he had witnessed and participated in. But presenting this information to the world was another challenge altogether. The stakes were high: his life, the safety of his family, and the integrity of his story depended on each step being executed with precision. The initial revelation came through an exclusive report published by a respected international journalist. The article, accompanied by a video interview, outlined FSB's role in the regime's machinery of disinformation and oppression. It detailed everything from fabricated cases against activists to the manipulation of public opinion through vast troll farms and state-controlled media. The journalist described FSB as a reluctant insider turned courageous whistleblower, framing his story as a rare glimpse into one of the most secretive intelligence operations in the world. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours of the report's release, news outlets across the globe picked up the story. Social media erupted with debates and speculation, with hashtags trending in multiple languages. Activist groups hailed FSB's bravery, using his revelations to amplify their calls for justice and reform. For the first time, the broader world was beginning to understand the extent of the regime's reach and its ability to manipulate narratives on a global scale. But the reception was not universally supportive. While many applauded FSB's courage, others questioned his motives and credibility. Some accused him of fabricating the story to seek asylum or financial gain, while others labeled him a traitor to his country. State-controlled media in his homeland launched an aggressive counter-campaign, branding him a liar and a foreign agent. They aired interviews with supposed former colleagues who discredited his claims and published doctored evidence, suggesting he had embezzled funds during his tenure. For FSB, the risks were immediate and tangible. The regime quickly issued an international warrant for his arrest, accusing him of treason and espionage. They began harassing his family, summoning them for questioning and restricting their movements to prevent them from leaving the country. FSB knew this was a tactic to pressure him into silence, but it only strengthened his resolve. He used every opportunity to highlight their plight, ensuring the world saw the regime's tactics in action. The revelation also brought personal challenges. FSB had lived a life of secrecy for so long that stepping into the public eye felt alien and dangerous. He was forced to constantly move between safe houses, surrounded by a rotating team of security personnel. Every outing, even for basic necessities, required careful planning. Paranoia became his constant companion. Every glance, every unfamiliar face felt like a potential threat. Yet, amidst the chaos, he found moments of relief in knowing that his story was reaching the people who needed to hear it most. One of the most significant risks came from his reliance on encrypted files and secure communication channels. Hackers, likely backed by the regime, attempted multiple times to access his documents and disrupt the dissemination of his story. There was also the looming threat of targeted misinformation campaigns designed to undermine his credibility. FSB worked closely with cybersecurity experts to safeguard his evidence, ensuring it remained intact and verifiable. Despite these risks, the revelations began to have a profound impact. International organizations started investigating the claims, corroborating his evidence with reports from other whistleblowers and independent researchers. Several governments expressed public condemnation of the regime's actions, while human rights groups used the findings to bolster their advocacy efforts. The regime's carefully curated image as a global power began to crack under the weight of FSB's disclosures. What struck FSB most during these early days was the outpouring of support from ordinary people. Letters from former dissidents, activists, and even strangers poured in, thanking him for his courage and sharing their own stories of suffering under the regime. These messages reminded him why he had taken this step, reinforcing his belief that exposing the truth was worth the immense personal cost. Yet, there were moments of doubt. The enormity of what he had undertaken often felt overwhelming, and the constant danger left him questioning whether he could sustain his efforts. But each time he saw his story spark new conversations, inspire protests, or bring solace to victims, he found renewed strength. Faidar's initial revelations were not just a turning point for the global perception of the regime. They were a turning point for him, transforming his role from a tool of oppression to a beacon of hope. The first steps of whistleblowing were the most dangerous and uncertain, but they were also the most necessary. Faidar's decision to speak out set in motion a chain of events that would continue to challenge the regime's control over truth and power. For the first time, he felt the weight of his past actions begin to lift, replaced by the determination to ensure that his story was just the beginning of a larger reckoning. The Factory of Trolls, as it was infamously dubbed, wasn't just a concept. It was a physical operation housed within a nondescript building on the outskirts of a major city. To the outside world, it appeared to be an ordinary office complex, but inside, it was the epicenter of a disinformation machine that operated at a scale few could imagine. Faidar, as part of his assignments, had spent months embedded in this operation, witnessing firsthand the meticulous planning and execution that turned lies into weapons of control. The operation was divided into floors, each dedicated to a specific function of the disinformation campaign. The first floor was the entry point, where hundreds of operatives sat at desks equipped with multiple monitors. These trolls managed fake accounts across social media platforms, each account designed to appear as authentic as possible. They had backstories, families, hobbies, details crafted to build credibility and trust among unsuspecting audiences. The operatives worked in shifts, ensuring the machine ran 24/7, saturating online spaces with propaganda and misinformation. The second floor housed the creative team, the architects of chaos. This group was responsible for crafting narratives that could manipulate public opinion. Their work ranged from creating viral memes that mocked opposition leaders to fabricating entire news articles that painted the regime in a favorable light. Faidar recalled one particularly effective campaign where a fabricated leaked email from a prominent activist was used to spread rumors of foreign funding. Within hours, the narrative had been picked up by state media, leading to public outrage and a significant blow to the activists' credibility. The third floor was the research and analytics hub. Here, operatives monitored trends, hashtags, and public sentiment in real time, using sophisticated algorithms to identify vulnerabilities in the opposition's messaging. They would then feed this information to the creative team, ensuring that every campaign targeted the weaknesses of its audience with precision. Faidar was often struck by the level of detail. Lists of journalists, activists, and even ordinary citizens who were deemed influential enough to warrant targeted campaigns. No voice was too small to be silenced if it posed a threat to the regime's narrative. The fourth floor, known as the Forge, was where the most sensitive operations were executed. This team specialized in creating fabricated evidence, forged documents, altered videos, and photoshopped images. Faidar witnessed the creation of entire dossiers meant to incriminate opposition leaders or discredit whistleblowers. The operatives here were experts in deception, ensuring their creations could withstand scrutiny long enough to inflict damage. Faidar remembered a case where they altered a video to show a protest leader meeting with a foreign diplomat, insinuating he was a foreign agent. The video went viral, and the leader's reputation was irreparably tarnished before the truth could emerge. What made the factory so effective was its integration with state-controlled media. Once a narrative was seeded online, it was amplified through government-run news outlets, giving it an air of legitimacy. Faidar watched as these manufactured stories were repeated on television, radio, and in newspapers, reaching audiences far beyond the digital realm. The factory didn't just create content, it controlled the entire ecosystem of information, ensuring that dissenting voices were drowned out by a carefully orchestrated cacophony of lies. The societal impacts were devastating. Misinformation campaigns didn't just discredit individuals, they sowed division, eroded trust, and incited fear. One campaign, Faidar participated in, targeted a peaceful protest movement advocating for electoral reforms. Trolls flooded social media with posts accusing the protesters of being violent extremists, accompanied by doctored videos that appeared to show them vandalizing public property. The narrative took hold, and within days, public support for the movement plummeted. Many protesters were arrested, their reputations destroyed by a campaign that began in the factory's dimly lit offices. Another operation targeted journalists who had been critical of the regime. Faidar remembered a specific case involving a well-known investigative reporter who had exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. The factory's operatives fabricated a scandal, complete with fake photographs and falsified financial records, portraying the journalist as a fraud. The smear campaign not only discredited her work but also led to threats against her and her family, forcing her to flee the country. The regime achieved its goal, silencing a powerful voice and sending a chilling message to others who dared to speak out. Beyond individuals, the factory's campaigns affected entire communities. FSB saw how trolls exploited ethnic and religious tensions, spreading false stories to inflame hostilities and create divisions. In one instance, a fabricated rumor about a religious group's involvement in a criminal conspiracy led to riots, leaving neighborhoods fractured and fearful. These tactics didn't just suppress dissent, they tore at the fabric of society, making unity against the regime nearly impossible. FSB's role in these operations left an indelible mark on him. He had been tasked with managing teams, analyzing the effectiveness of campaigns, and even creating content himself. Each assignment reinforced the ruthlessness of the machine he served, but it also deepened his resolve to expose its inner workings. He began to document everything: screenshots of directives, copies of fabricated evidence, and details of specific campaigns. He knew that one day, the world would need to see the truth about the factory of trolls and its role in perpetuating a system built on lies. The revelation of the factory's existence had a profound impact when it was included in FSB's whistleblowing efforts. Activist groups and independent media picked apart his evidence, exposing the scale of the disinformation machine and its tactics. The regime's denials rang hollow as international organizations corroborated his claims with their own investigations. For many, the factory of trolls became a symbol of modern authoritarianism, a reminder of how easily truth can be manipulated in the digital age. FSB often reflected on the societal damage wrought by the factory. It wasn't just about discrediting opposition or controlling narratives. It was about eroding the very concept of truth, leaving people unable to discern reality from fiction. The factory's success lay not just in the lies it told, but in the confusion it created, ensuring that no one could trust anything, not even each other. Unveiling the factory of trolls was one of the most significant steps in FSB's journey to redemption. By exposing its operations and impact, he hoped to dismantle the system he had once served and rebuild the trust it had destroyed. The factory was a testament to the regime's power, but FSB's revelations were a testament to the power of truth, a force he now wielded with the same determination he had once used to suppress it. And as the world began to see the factory for what it was, FSB knew his battle was far from over. It had only just begun. The work FSB carried out for the regime was a masterclass in deception, built on layers of lies designed to maintain control. Each mission, each report, and each target was a cog in a sprawling machine of systemic abuse. As FSB delved deeper into his role, the personal accounts of wrongdoing he witnessed and participated in began to haunt him. These weren't abstract operations. They involved real people, their lives irreversibly damaged by the regime's relentless pursuit of power. One of the most vivid examples was the case of a schoolteacher named Larisa Petrova, a beloved figure in her small town. She had become an outspoken critic of local corruption, exposing how funds intended for school renovations were funneled into the pockets of government officials. Larisa's efforts gained traction, and her online posts were shared widely, drawing unwanted attention from the regime. FSB was tasked with neutralizing her influence. The plan was insidious. FSB's team fabricated a story accusing Larisa of indoctrinating her students with anti-national values. They planted fake lesson plans in her records, creating the impression that she was teaching extremist ideologies. To bolster the narrative, they doctored photographs showing her attending opposition rallies she had never been to. These materials were then leaked to sympathetic media outlets, which ran inflammatory stories that painted Larisa as a danger to her community. The backlash was immediate. Parents demanded her removal, the school board dismissed her, and she became the target of online harassment. Larisa was eventually forced to leave town, her reputation destroyed. FSB couldn't forget her face, which he had only seen in surveillance photos, an expression of determination that was erased by the lies he helped spread. Another operation targeted a doctor named Timur Khan, who had been providing medical aid to protesters injured during demonstrations. Timur's clinic became a safe haven for those who couldn't risk going to state hospitals, where they feared being reported to authorities. His actions were seen as defiance against the regime, and he became a target for their disinformation campaigns. FSB's task was to discredit Timur by fabricating evidence of malpractice. Working with the Forge team, they created fake patient complaints, alleging that Timur's negligence had resulted in deaths. They even altered medical records to make it appear as though he had been prescribing banned substances. When these accusations were leaked to the press, Timur was stripped of his medical license, and his clinic was shut down. The regime touted the closure as a victory against dangerous individuals, while Timur was left to fight a legal battle he couldn't win. For FSB, this operation was particularly painful. He saw how a man dedicated to saving lives was brought down by the very system that claimed to protect its citizens. The abuse extended beyond individuals to entire communities. FSB recalled an operation in a rural region where villagers had organized to oppose the construction of a state-sponsored industrial project. The project threatened their farmland and water supply, and they had filed petitions and held peaceful protests to voice their concerns. The regime, unwilling to tolerate any resistance, branded the villagers as foreign-funded agitators. FSB's team fabricated reports alleging that the protest leaders were receiving money from international NGOs with anti-state agendas. These reports were used to justify a brutal crackdown. Many villagers were arrested, their homes raided in the middle of the night. FSB later learned that the project went ahead, leaving the land polluted and uninhabitable. The villagers were scattered, their community shattered. It was a stark reminder of how the regime's greed and need for control left nothing untouched. One of the most egregious examples of systemic abuse involved the case of a journalist named Elena Markova. Elena had spent years investigating corruption at the highest levels of government. Her work was meticulous, backed by hard evidence, and her articles resonated with a public hungry for accountability. The regime saw her as a direct threat and launched a multi-pronged operation to destroy her. FSB was tasked with managing the digital arm of this campaign. The operation began with an online smear campaign, accusing Elena of fabricating her stories and accepting bribes from opposition parties. Troll farms flooded her social media accounts with threats and insults, creating the illusion of widespread public disdain. When this failed to deter her, the regime escalated. They fabricated emails suggesting she had an affair with a married politician, using doctored photographs to support the narrative. The personal attack devastated Elena, and while she tried to continue her work, the harassment became unbearable. The final blow came when her bank accounts were frozen based on falsified financial records created by the regime. Unable to work, provide for her family, or even leave the country, Elena was forced into silence. The regime's reach extended into FSB's assignments involving religious groups. In one case, a peaceful congregation that had been advocating for interfaith dialogue was labeled as a radical sect by state media. FSB's team planted forged documents that suggested the group had ties to foreign terrorist organizations. These accusations led to widespread fear and suspicion, forcing the group to disband. The state seized their property under the guise of national security, turning a symbol of unity into another tool of oppression. These examples were just a fraction of the systemic abuses FSB witnessed. Entire groups were targeted as part of the regime's effort to stifle dissent and maintain its grip on power. Activists were branded as terrorists, whistleblowers were painted as traitors, and ordinary citizens were swept up in the tide of disinformation. The regime's playbook was ruthless: destroy credibility, sow fear, and ensure that no voice rose above the noise of their propaganda. FSB's participation in these operations left scars that words could not erase. Each fabricated report, each life disrupted, and each community destroyed added to the weight on his conscience. He began documenting these stories, not just as evidence for his eventual revelations, but as a way to remember the people whose lives were caught in the crossfire of a regime's unrelenting quest for control. One of FSB's final assignments before his defection involved a group of university students advocating for democratic reforms. He had been sent to infiltrate their network, report on their activities, and gather material to justify a crackdown. He succeeded, as always, but this time was different. He saw the hopes of the students crushed by the system, their unity shattered by arrests and propaganda. For FSB, this was a stark reminder that the regime's abuses were not just systemic but deeply personal, targeting anyone who dared to dream of change. These personal accounts of wrongdoing weren't just the regime's shame, they were FSB's burden. They reminded him daily of the cost of complicity and the price others paid for his silence. But they also fueled his resolve to expose the truth, to give voice to those who had been silenced, and to ensure that the world understood the full scope of the abuses he had been a part of. By sharing these stories, FSB hoped to bring accountability to a system that thrived on impunity and to begin the long journey toward redemption. When FSB's revelations first broke, the impact was seismic. His story wasn't just another whistleblower account. It was a window into the shadowy operations of an intelligence apparatus that had gone unchecked for decades. For the first time, the world saw the intricate, methodical workings of a regime that used lies as its most potent weapon, turning disinformation into a cornerstone of its power. The reaction was swift, polarizing, and far-reaching. The international media exploded with coverage. Major outlets ran headlines detailing the regime's factory of trolls, its campaigns to discredit activists, and its manipulation of global narratives. News anchors dissected the documents FIDA provided, showing how entire movements had been silenced through fabricated scandals and coordinated harassment. Analysis pieces highlighted the unprecedented scale of the disinformation operations, drawing comparisons to Cold War-era propaganda, but noting the sophisticated digital tools now employed to amplify their reach. Global organizations quickly mobilized in response. Human rights groups seized on FIDA's evidence to pressure governments to take action. They cited specific cases of activists, journalists, and communities that had been targeted, demanding justice for those whose lives had been destroyed. Amnesty International released a report corroborating many of FIDA's claims, using independent investigations to confirm the tactics he described. The United Nations Human Rights Council called for an inquiry into the regime's abuses, marking the first step toward international accountability. The public reaction was equally intense. Online, the hashtag #ExposeTheLies began trending within hours of the story's publication. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for debate, with users sharing FIDA's revelations and others attempting to defend the regime. Activist groups used the momentum to reignite campaigns that had been stifled by disinformation, pointing to FIDA's evidence as proof of their legitimacy. Petitions calling for sanctions against the regime gained millions of signatures, and protests erupted in major cities, demanding accountability. But the revelations also had far-reaching implications for the intelligence community. FIDA's story exposed the vulnerabilities of a system that relied on secrecy to maintain control. Governments around the world began to scrutinize their own digital policies, recognizing the growing threat of state-sponsored disinformation. Cybersecurity experts warned that the techniques FIDA described were not unique to his regime. They were part of a broader trend in global politics where truth was weaponized for power. The revelations prompted a wave of reforms, with some countries tightening regulations on social media platforms to combat coordinated propaganda campaigns. The intelligence apparatus FIDA had left behind faced unprecedented scrutiny. His revelations detailed not only its operations but also its culture, a system built on fear, loyalty, and ruthless efficiency. Former operatives, emboldened by FIDA's courage, began to come forward with their own stories, adding layers to the picture he had painted. Internal documents leaked by other whistleblowers revealed the regime's frantic efforts to mitigate the fallout, including hastily disbanding certain operations and reassigning key personnel. One of the most immediate impacts was on the factory of trolls itself. Within weeks of the revelations, international tech companies began dismantling thousands of fake accounts tied to the operation. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram issued public statements acknowledging their role in unwittingly hosting these networks and pledged to do better. For the regime, this was a devastating blow, as one of its most effective tools for controlling narratives was suddenly crippled. Without the anonymity and reach these platforms provided, the disinformation campaigns lost much of their potency. Domestically, the regime responded with predictable aggression. State-controlled media launched a full-scale attack on FIDA's character, branding him a traitor and a liar. They aired interviews with supposed colleagues who discredited his claims, presenting him as a disgruntled operative seeking attention. Despite these efforts, the cracks in the regime's facade were beginning to show. FIDA's evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss, and the public, both at home and abroad, began to question the narratives they had been fed for years. For the regime's targets, activists, journalists, and dissidents, the revelations were a bittersweet vindication. Many who had been discredited or silenced finally had proof of the systematic campaign against them. Activist groups regained credibility, and some journalists were able to resume their work with renewed support. Yet for others, the damage had already been done. Lives had been irreparably altered, careers destroyed, and communities fractured. FIDA's revelations brought them a sense of justice, but also a reminder of the immense cost of the regime's actions. FIDA himself became a polarizing figure. To some, he was a hero, a man who risked everything to expose the truth. To others, particularly those loyal to the regime, he was a traitor who had betrayed his country. In exile, FIDA continued to face threats and harassment, but he also found himself at the center of a global movement for accountability. He collaborated with human rights organizations, testified before international tribunals, and used his platform to amplify the voices of those still suffering under the regime's control. As FIDA's revelations gained traction, their ripple effects reached unexpected corners of the world. Other regimes, with similar disinformation machines, began to feel the pressure as journalists and activists drew parallels to their tactics. Whistleblowers in these countries saw FIDA's courage as a call to action. leading to a surge of leaks and disclosures about state-sponsored manipulation in regions far beyond his homeland. It became clear that Fidar's story wasn't just about one regime, it was about a global reckoning with the way power was wielded in the digital age. The long-term implications of Fidar's revelations are still unfolding. They have reshaped the global conversation about disinformation, forcing governments, tech companies, and societies to confront the ways in which truth can be manipulated. They have exposed the fragility of democratic systems when faced with coordinated propaganda and highlighted the need for greater transparency and accountability in the digital age. For Fidar, the impact of his actions was both a source of pride and a heavy burden. The public reaction affirmed the importance of his decision to defect and speak out, but it also underscored the immense responsibility he now carried. His revelations were just the beginning of a larger battle against a system that thrived on lies, and he was determined to see it through. As the world grappled with the truths he had exposed, Fidar's story stood as a testament to the power of one voice to challenge even the most entrenched forces of deception. It was a reminder that even in the darkest corners, the truth could spark a light powerful enough to illuminate the way forward. Fidar's life after exposing the regime has been a mixture of triumph and isolation. In many ways, he has become a symbol of courage and defiance, but the cost of speaking out has left scars that are difficult to heal. Now living in exile, Fidar's days are filled with both purpose and an undercurrent of unease, as he navigates the consequences of challenging one of the most powerful intelligence operations in the world. His location remains a closely guarded secret, shared only with a handful of trusted allies. Security has become a constant in his life. His movements are carefully planned, and his communication tightly monitored to avoid detection by the regime's operatives. Despite these precautions, threats continue to loom. Anonymous messages remind him that he remains a target, and he knows the regime's reach extends far beyond its borders. Yet, Fidar remains resolute, refusing to let fear silence him again. In his quiet moments, Fidar reflects on the journey that brought him to this point. He often revisits the faces and stories of the people whose lives were altered by the regime's disinformation campaigns. The teacher forced to flee, the journalist silenced, the protesters imprisoned. These memories are a painful reminder of his complicity, but also serve as the driving force behind his current work. "I can't undo the past," he often tells himself, "but I can fight to ensure it doesn't happen again." Fidar has dedicated himself to justice, collaborating with human rights organizations and advocacy groups to bring attention to the regime's abuses. He provides first-hand accounts of the operations he was involved in, using his insider knowledge to help others identify and counteract disinformation. His testimony has been instrumental in shaping policies aimed at combating state-sponsored propaganda, and he has become a sought-after voice in global discussions about information warfare. Part of Fidar's work includes supporting other whistleblowers. He understands the fear and isolation they face and uses his platform to amplify their voices and ensure their stories are heard. "I was lucky to find people who believed me," he says during interviews. "Now it's my turn to be that support for others." He has become a mentor to those seeking to expose corruption and oppression, offering guidance and resources to navigate the dangerous path he once walked alone. Fidar also spends much of his time raising awareness about the human cost of disinformation. Through speeches, writings, and interviews, he shares the personal accounts of those targeted by the regime's campaigns. These stories, often heartbreaking, are his way of honoring the victims and ensuring their struggles are not forgotten. "Their pain is real," he says. "Their voices deserve to be heard, even if they were silenced at home." Despite his achievements, life in exile has taken a toll on Fidar's mental and emotional well-being. He struggles with feelings of guilt and isolation, knowing that while he has found safety, his family remains vulnerable. The regime's harassment of his relatives continues, and he is painfully aware of the sacrifices they have made because of his actions. He often writes letters to them, though they go unsent, as any contact could put them at greater risk. These letters are a way for him to process his emotions, a quiet act of remembrance for the connections he has lost. Fidar's reflections on his journey are complex. He is proud of the stand he took and the impact his revelations have had, but he is also deeply aware of the personal cost. "I used to think loyalty was everything," he says. "Now I know that loyalty to truth and justice is far more important than loyalty to a system that destroys lives." He views his life as a testament to the power of redemption, a chance to make amends for the harm he once caused. Looking to the future, Fidar remains committed to his mission. He is working on a book that chronicles his experiences, detailing the inner workings of the regime's intelligence operations and the personal cost of living a double life. The book is not just a memoir but a call to action, a plea for greater transparency, accountability, and vigilance in the fight against disinformation. He hopes it will inspire others to question, resist, and stand up for truth. FIDAR's ongoing efforts are driven by a simple belief that exposing lies is the first step toward justice. He knows the fight is far from over, but he draws strength from the impact his revelations have already had. For FIDAR, life after exposure is not about returning to normalcy, it is about building a new path, one where his voice can continue to challenge oppression and empower those who seek change. "I've seen what the darkness can do," he says. "Now it's my job to bring light to it, no matter the cost." FIDAR's story is more than an account of courage or a glimpse into the workings of a powerful regime. It is a lesson for the world about the fragility of truth, the cost of complicity, and the power of resistance in the face of authoritarianism. His journey from an operative within a shadowy system to a whistleblower who risked everything to expose the truth underscores principles that resonate. Far beyond his personal experiences, one of the clearest lessons from FIDAR's story is the importance of accountability. The regime he served thrived on secrecy, using its unchecked power to manipulate narratives and silence dissent. For years, its actions went unchallenged, largely because there was no mechanism to hold it accountable. FIDAR's revelations disrupted this cycle, shining a light on practices that had operated in the shadows for decades. His story reminds the world that without transparency, power becomes corrupt, and without accountability, that corruption becomes systemic. Governments, institutions, and individuals must be held responsible for their actions to prevent abuses of power from becoming the norm. Another critical takeaway is the role of complicity in enabling authoritarian regimes. FIDAR often reflects on the years he spent serving the system, believing he had no other choice. His story demonstrates how regimes exploit fear, loyalty, and survival instincts to turn ordinary people into tools of oppression. But it also shows that complicity is not inevitable. FIDAR's decision to defect and speak out is a testament to the fact that individuals, even those entrenched in unjust systems, have the power to resist. His journey illustrates the importance of personal responsibility and the courage it takes to choose integrity over convenience. FIDAR's story also highlights the destructive power of disinformation. The regime's ability to control narratives was central to its strength, allowing it to manipulate public opinion, discredit opponents, and sow division among its people. FIDAR's revelations exposed how easily truth can be weaponized in the digital age, where lies travel faster than facts, and trust in institutions is fragile. This lesson is particularly urgent for the modern world, where disinformation campaigns have become a global phenomenon. FIDAR's story challenges governments, tech companies, and societies to recognize the dangers of misinformation and to take proactive steps to protect the integrity of public discourse. Resistance, as FIDAR's journey demonstrates, is not just about standing against oppression, but about creating an alternative vision for the future. His story is a reminder that even in the darkest systems, there are cracks where light can enter. FIDAR's choice to expose the regime was not just an act of defiance, but a declaration of hope, a belief that the truth could inspire change. This lesson is especially powerful for those who feel powerless in the face of authoritarianism. Resistance does not have to begin with mass movements. It can start with one voice, one action, one decision to challenge injustice. At the heart of FIDAR's story is a profound lesson about the value of truth. For years, the regime sought to distort reality, convincing its citizens that lies were facts and dissent was treason. FIDAR's decision to expose the truth, even at great personal risk, underscores the fundamental importance of truth in sustaining freedom and justice. His story is a call to defend truth in all its forms, to question narratives, and to ensure that lies, no matter how pervasive, are challenged. FIDAR's journey also serves as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite years of complicity, despite the fear and isolation that came with defecting, he found the strength to fight back. His story is a testament to the fact that it is never too late to make a difference. Redemption is possible, even for those who feel they have strayed too far from their values. The courage to face one's past and take steps toward change is a lesson that resonates universally, inspiring others to seek justice in their own lives. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from FIDAR's story is the power of solidarity. While his journey began in isolation, it was the support of others, journalists, activists, and human rights organizations, that amplified his voice and ensured his revelations had an impact. His story demonstrates that collective action is essential in the fight against authoritarianism. No individual can challenge a regime alone, but together, people can build movements that hold power accountable and protect the vulnerable. In the end, FIDAR's story is not just about exposing a regime, it is about the enduring struggle between oppression and freedom, deception and truth. fear and courage. It is a reminder that authoritarianism thrives on apathy and silence, and that resistance, no matter how small, is a powerful antidote. His story teaches the world that while the battle for justice is long and arduous, it is a fight worth waging, for it is in that struggle that humanity finds its strength and its hope. Fidar's journey is far from over, but his lessons are clear. The fight for accountability begins with speaking out, the defense of truth requires vigilance, and the courage to resist lies at the heart of any meaningful change. His story is a call to action for all who value justice, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, one voice can make a difference, one truth can shatter lies, and one act of defiance can inspire the world. Fidar's story, though marked by hardship and sacrifice, is ultimately one of hope. It is a testament to the power of truth and the resilience of those who dare to speak it. Despite the dangers he faced and the cost he bore, his decision to expose the regime's abuses has sparked a global movement for accountability, proving that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged. His journey offers a simple but profound message. Change begins with courage, and courage begins with each of us. The world Fidar fought against is one that thrives on secrecy, manipulation, fear. But his revelations show that such systems are not invincible. They rely on silence to survive. By speaking out, Fidar disrupted the cycle, demonstrating that truth, once revealed, has the power to unravel even the most meticulously constructed lies. His story reminds us that standing up for what is right, no matter how daunting, is the first step toward creating a more just and transparent world. For those who feel powerless in the face of systemic abuses, Fidar's journey is a beacon of hope. He was one man within a vast apparatus, yet his actions have sparked global conversations and inspired others to take a stand. His story proves that even in the darkest systems, individuals can make a difference. It is a call to all of us to resist apathy and recognize the strength we hold when we choose to confront injustice. As we reflect on Fidar's revelations, we must also consider our own role in fostering a world that values transparency and justice. The fight against disinformation, corruption, and abuse is not one that can be won by a few. It requires collective effort. It requires questioning the narratives we are told, holding power accountable, and amplifying the voices of those who risk everything to expose the truth. Each of us has a part to play, whether through supporting independent journalism, educating ourselves about systemic issues, or standing in solidarity with those who challenge oppression. Fidar's story is not just a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. It is a reminder of the power of resilience, redemption, and hope. It shows that even when the odds seem insurmountable, change is possible when people come together to demand it. The truth he fought to reveal has already sparked reforms, inspired new movements, and exposed the vulnerabilities of systems that once seemed untouchable. His journey is proof that the fight for justice, though long and arduous, is one worth undertaking. As Fidar continues his work, collaborating with organizations and mentoring others who seek to expose wrongdoing, he carries with him a deep belief in the potential for a better future. His message is clear. The world can change, but only if we stand together against lies and systemic abuses. The truth has power, he often says, but only if we're willing to protect it. Let Fidar's story inspire action. Let it remind us that no matter how entrenched a system of oppression may seem, it can be dismantled when people stand up for what is right. Let it push us to value transparency, to question what we are told, and to support those who risk everything to bring the truth to light. The fight for accountability begins with a single voice, but it is sustained by the collective will of many. As Fidar's journey shows, the path to justice is not easy, but it is possible. Together, we can create a world where truth triumphs over lies, where power is held accountable, and where the courage of one can inspire the hope of millions. Let his story be the spark that ignites change. The future is unwritten, and it is ours to shape. One act of defiance, one call for justice, one truth at a time.